Welcome to Creepy Night, where shadows speak and stories never truly die. Tonight, we open another tale, one whispered through fog, born of fear, and written in blood. So, turn off the lights and listen. On a misty morning, Elias Vane received a letter. No address, no sender. Only a few words. The house is waiting for you. Deep within the pine forest, he found it. Pinewood Manor. Forgotten by time, yet somehow still alive. Every step he took, the walls groaned, and the mirrors reflected faces that were not his own. They say the house remembers those who enter, and that night Pinewood Manor remembered him.
The letter arrived on a mist-laden morning, its edges browned with age, as though it had spent decades wandering through the hands of some indifferent fate before finding Elias Vane. He held it with fingers trembling, not from cold, though the autumn air pressed damp and chill upon the windowsill, but from a quiet dread that he could not name. The parchment bore the seal of his late uncle, Elias Vane, a man whom Elias had known only in faint reminiscences. A shadow at the hearth, a stern figure in a study crowded with books and taxidermied birds, a man whose voice had seemed carved from the very walls of Thornwood Hall. Jenkins. The missive was brief, yet its weight pressed upon him with the gravity of centuries. To my nephew, Elias, you are the heir of Pinewood Manor. Come without delay. The house awaits. No address accompanied the letter, no instructions save for a small key, cold and heavy, whose metal seemed to hum faintly in his palm. And though Elias had never known Pinewood Manor save through distant family whispers, he felt an inexplicable pull, a summons older than reason itself, as if the forest beyond the city held its breath in anticipation of his arrival. By dusk, he found himself upon the edge of the pine forest, the trees dark and sentinel-like, their needles whispering secrets that the wind would not carry elsewhere. The path was narrow, scarcely more than a vein of trampled earth through a wilderness of towering trunks. With every step, the daylight waned, filtered through a canopy so dense it seemed to swallow the horizon. Somewhere far above, a crow called, its note sharp and accusatory, and Elias imagined the voice of the forest itself, murmuring in half-formed syllables, "Turn back, or come further." Yet he pressed on. The manor revealed itself slowly, a phantom emerging from the mist. Its spires and chimneys pierced the fog like jagged teeth. Stone walls, blackened with age and climbing ivy, rose from the uneven ground. Windows gaped like blind eyes, dark and unyielding. The gate, wrought iron and twisted by rust, hung ajar, as though inviting him to trespass, or perhaps warning him that he had already done so. A shiver ran down his spine, and he drew his coat tighter, yet the sensation was not wholly of cold. There was something else. The weight of eyes unseen, watching him from shadowed corners of the forest, from the hollows of broken branches, from the very soil underfoot. He crossed the threshold, key in hand, and the door yielded with a groan, as though exhaling centuries of dust and silence. The smell of decay, of wood rot and something indefinably sweet and cloying struck him immediately. The hall beyond was cavernous, a cathedral of gloom. The ceiling rose beyond sight, its beams darkened with age, and the walls were lined with faded tapestries that whispered stories in frayed threads. A grand staircase wound upward, its banisters splintered and slick with dust. Footsteps echoed hollowly, though no other soul stirred. Elias paused, key still in hand, listening. A sigh. Soft, human, perhaps imagined, drifted from the darkness above. He raised a trembling candle and cast its wavering light across the walls. Portraits leered down from their frames, ancestors with eyes too sharp, too knowing. Their gazes clung to him as he moved, following, pressing upon the mind with a silent insistence. In one, a woman with hollowed cheeks and sorrowful eyes seemed to murmur. Though her lips did not move, her gaze heavy with accusation or plea. It was impossible to say which. He ascended the staircase, each step protesting beneath his weight, and found the upper hall lined with doors, each swollen and crooked, some half-broken, some entirely closed. The air here was colder, and the candle flickered, as if resisting the drafts that moved through the wood like living thing. He paused before a door at the far end, key in hand, and felt the strange pulse of the house beneath his fingertip. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The house breathed. The boards beneath him hummed with a quiet life, a rhythm that echoed his own pulse and made the hairs along his neck rise. Inside the room, time seemed to hesitate. Dust motes floated in the candlelight like tiny ghosts. Furniture lay in ruinous disarray, cloths rotted, and the once luxurious carpet was threadbare, its colors faded to ash. Yet in the center of the chamber stood a desk, surprisingly intact, as though preserved by some deliberate hand. Upon it lay a journal bound in cracked leather. Elias's fingers trembled as he opened it. The pages, brittle and yellow. The entries were at first mundane. Accounts of household affairs, notes on the weather, lists of visitors. But soon they grew strange, frantic even, as the writer, a distant relative, a Vane unknown to Elias, described things that should not exist. Rooms that moved themselves. Footsteps when no one was present. Whispers that spoke his name in every room, every corridor, every shadow. The handwriting wavered, trembled, as though the pen itself feared what it scribed. One entry chilled Elias more than the rest. The house remembers. It knows us. It is patient. It waits. It waits for the one who will see too much, who will listen too closely, who will linger where the doors do not wish him to stay. Kneel. A noise startled him, faint at first, then unmistakable. A creak from the corridor outside. The candle flickered violently, and he swore he saw movement at the edge of his vision. A shadow, longer than it should be, curling around the far wall. He turned, and the corridor was empty. Yet the air felt charged, heavy with expectation, and Elias understood that the house had noticed him. Hours passed in that room, though the candle dwindled and the shadows grew longer, and still he could not leave. Every exit seemed to shift, every door farther than it had been, or closer, or subtly distort. The house itself had become a labyrinth, responsive to his presence, aware of his every thought, every hesitation. Outside, the wind rose in the pines, carrying whispers that seemed to weave with the groaning of timber and the shifting of floorboards. Elias sank into a chair, exhausted, heart hammering, and began to write in his own journal, compelled by a need he could not name. The ink moved sluggishly, thick with the weight of the house's attention. He wrote of the portraits, of the whispers, of the eyes that seemed to follow him. And yet, despite the terror, he felt a pull, a fascination that was almost tender toward the mystery of the manor. He understood with a dreadful clarity that to leave now would be to deny the house its due. It was patient, yes, but persistent, and it had already chosen him. The candle guttered, threatening to extinguish, and Elias shivered. Shadows lengthened into forms that were almost human, almost familiar. The house exhaled a long, slow sigh, and he felt its intent pressing upon him. To reveal its secrets, yes, but at a cost not yet measured. Outside, the forest seemed to lean closer, the pines swaying as though in whispered counsel. Somewhere, deep within the house, a door creaked open, unseen, calling. Elias's lips parted, though no sound emerged. The manor awaited, patient as stone and old as the soil. And Elias Vane, drawn by blood, by curiosity, by some unseen covenant with ancestry and fate, took his first step into the darkness of the house that would not release him. The night closed in, thick and velvet dark, as the manor watched, listening, and perhaps smiling. The dawn broke, though it did so reluctantly, as if the sun itself feared to shine upon Pinewood Manor. Elias awoke upon the cold, splintered floor of the chamber he had claimed the night before, his candle long extinguished, leaving him in a half-light of gray and shadow. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and rot, and yet beneath it lingered something else, a sweetness, subtle and insidious, like decayed flowers pressed between old books, compelling him to linger, to breathe, to obey. To obey. He rose, shivering, and explored further, stepping lightly upon boards that groaned in complaint. The hall stretched before him, lined with doors, each more ancient than the last, each bearing its own peculiar decay. Some were swollen and sealed shut, as though the wood had exhaled over centuries and refused to reopen. Others swung upon hinges cracked and rusted, revealing chambers that seemed untouched by time, yet somehow populated with a lingering presence that defied reason. In the first room, Elias found a sitting chamber, its furniture draped with moth-eaten covers. The fireplace was filled with ashes cold as stone, yet upon the mantel lay a clock, frozen at precisely midnight. As he approached, he felt a vibration under his palm, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present. The air seemed to thrum with anticipation, and he realized, with a start, that the house itself breathed in measured rhythms, as if aware of his own heartbeat and eager to match it. A faint sound drew him further, the soft creaking of floorboards above, though the upper hall seemed empty. His pulse quickened, a tremor of fear mingling with fascination. He reached a room where the walls were lined with portraits, each painted in oils that had cracked and faded with age. Ancestors stared down with eyes so lifelike they seemed to follow him with each careful step. One in particular, a man with hollowed cheeks and a gaze both accusing and mournful, made Elias flinch, for in that gaze he recognized an echo of his own reflection, twisted by the lens of centuries. He moved on, drawn by some irresistible compulsion, until he found a library. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed by his passing, and books, many bound in cracked leather, lined the shelves like sentinels. Elias ran his fingers over the spines, feeling an odd warmth beneath the dust, as if the books themselves awaited his touch. He drew one from the shelf, a volume of poetry by some forgotten poet of the family, and a folded sheet of paper fell to the floor. It bore a single line in a handwriting both familiar and alien. "Do not trust the walls. They speak when you are alone." A shiver ran down his spine. He looked about, suddenly aware of the oppressive silence, the way it pressed against him, thick and tangible, almost as if the house had drawn its breath and held it. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, refusing to yield to the weak morning light filtering through grimy windows. The library seemed to stretch beyond reason, corridors of books unfolding in impossible directions, and Elias felt his sense of time distort. Hours could have passed, or minutes, or decades. He could not tell. He found another door, low and unassuming, leading to a chamber that had been sealed for who knew how long. Inside, the remnants of a feast lay preserved upon a long table. Platters tarnished with age, goblets dulled with verdigris, and a candelabrum crooked with melted wax. Yet it was not the decay alone that unsettled him, but the arrangement, meticulous and deliberate, as though the table were set for invisible guests who would return at any moment. Elias dared not touch anything. From somewhere above, a whisper floated down the staircase, soft as moth wings against silk. His name, Elias. Elias. It carried no menace, yet it filled him with a dread that he could not dismiss. The voice seemed to originate from the very walls themselves, curling through the timber, flowing beneath the floorboards, slipping through the cracks in the ceiling. He spun, candle trembling in his hand, but saw nothing save the wavering shadows that danced in the flickering light. He stumbled into another room, small and square, entirely bare except for a chair positioned against the wall. Upon the chair lay a journal, much like the one he had found the night before, but older, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Elias opened it and began to read. The entries were written by one Elias Vane, a woman who had vanished decades earlier. She wrote of strange occurrences in the manor, the shifting of rooms, the whispering shadows, the way the house seemed to mirror her thoughts and desires. One line chilled him to the bone. "I saw myself in the mirror, yet the reflection was not mine. It smiled when I despaired and despaired when I smiled. The house keeps us all if we linger too long." The room seemed to press closer as he read, the walls bending, the corners elongating, as if the manor itself sought to enfold him. A cold draft whispered through the window, carrying with it the faintest scent of pine and something rotting beneath. Elias shivered and tried to close the journal, but his fingers lingered on the page, compelled by a fascination he could not resist. Hours, perhaps days, passed in that room, unmarked by the sun or moon. Elias moved from chamber to chamber, discovering doors that led to rooms he could not remember entering, corridors that twisted impossibly, and staircases that ended abruptly, as if swallowed by the floor itself. Shadows elongated and recoiled in unnatural rhythms, and he began to hear faint footsteps following him, though he knew he was alone. Sometimes, in the reflection of tarnished mirrors, he glimpsed shapes that were not his own. A fleeting figure behind him, a hand upon his shoulder that vanished when he turned. His dreams were no respite. At night, he slept upon the cold floor, candle flickering beside him, and the manor invaded his slumber. He dreamed of corridors that twisted into darkness, of faces pressed against windows from outside, of voices calling his name in tones both pleading and mocking. In one particularly vivid vision, he wandered into a room where the walls were lined with clocks, each ticking at a different speed. As he watched, the clocks melted, dripping like wax, and from the puddles rose shapes, shadowed forms that lifted their faces to him, and he knew, without knowing how, that they were former residents of the manor, trapped by their own fascination, their own fear. By the third night, Elias felt a strange weakening, as if the house had begun to claim him, threading its presence into his body. He looked into a mirror in a hallway and recoiled. His reflection wavered, blurred, as though he were less substance than shadow. The portraits in the hall seemed to lean closer, their painted eyes glinting with recognition, as if aware that he had noticed their watchfulness. He felt watched, measured, and cataloged. Each step he took resonated with the memory of those who had come before, their echoes lingering in the very boards beneath his feet. Despite the fear, or perhaps because of it, Elias was drawn ever deeper. The house whispered its secrets, hinted at its hidden chambers, and teased the edges of knowledge he had not known he desired. He found a room with walls entirely lined with mirrors, reflecting him infinitely in the dim candlelight. But as he looked closer, he realized with a jolt that some reflections were not his own. One held the visage of a child, staring at him with hollow eyes. Another, a woman in rags, weeping silently. And yet, in each, a trace of his own features lingered, as if the manor was beginning to fold him into its gallery of echoes. The boundaries between rooms, between past and present, began to blur. Doors appeared where none had been. Staircases twisted impossibly, and corridors seemed to lead him back to chambers he had not yet entered. The whispers grew insistent, almost intelligible now, murmuring not merely his name, but fragments of thought. Fear him. Fear yourself. Stay. Stay. And in that labyrinth of shadow and memory, Elias understood the terrible truth. Pinewood Manor was not merely a house. It was a living record, a vessel of those who had lingered too long, a collector of souls who had gazed too intently upon its secrets. Each room preserved a fragment of life, a breath of the past, a lingering whisper of despair and longing. And now, he had been noticed. The forest beyond the windows sighed in the wind, carrying the murmurs of pine needles and distant branches. Somewhere, a door creaked open. Elias stepped forward, heart hammering, drawn toward the next revelation, knowing, with a terror that thrilled and suffocated him, that the house had already begun to claim him. The shadows waited, the whispers waited, and the manor, patient as stone and alive as thought, began its slow, inexorable embrace. Night descended upon Pinewood Manor like a living shroud, heavy with the scent of pine and decay. The moon, obscured by a thick canopy of clouds, offered only the faintest silver glow, barely illuminating the twisted outlines of the manor's spires and gables. Elias Vane moved cautiously through the halls, candle flickering, casting grotesque shadows upon the walls. Each shadow seemed to writhe and lengthen, stretching into forms that were nearly human, yet unnervingly wrong. The whispers began almost imperceptibly. At first, they were little more than the rustling of the trees outside, the sighing of the wind through broken shutters. Then they grew distinct, soft syllables curling through the corridors like smoke. "Elias! Elias!" The voice was familiar yet alien, echoing in a way that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He paused, straining to listen, but each echo returned, multiplied, until the corridors themselves seemed alive, speaking his name in a chorus of countless voices. Compelled by a mix of terror and fascination, Elias followed the sound. The manor seemed to guide him, its architecture twisting subtly as he walked. Doors that he had passed hours before now opened into new chambers, and corridors stretched impossibly long, bending light and perception. Sometimes, a doorway led him back to the same room he had left, though nothing appeared identical. Dust hung thickly in the air, and the faint scent of decayed wood and forgotten flowers pressed upon his senses, making him dizzy and unsteady. In one hallway, a mirror leaned precariously against the wall. Day. Elias paused, catching his reflection, but it was not entirely his own. The image in the glass was warped, elongated, and in the corner of his eye, he glimpsed a shadowy figure, tall and thin, faceless, yet radiating a presence that pressed against his chest. When he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the quivering candlelight to illuminate the warped corridor. He realized, with a shiver, that the manor was teaching him the boundaries of perception, eroding the certainty of his senses. He stumbled into a room he had not seen before. Its walls were lined with portraits, their subjects frozen in oil for centuries, yet there was movement in their eyes. The eyes of an elderly man shifted subtly to follow Elias as he moved. The lips of a young woman trembled, forming words he could not hear. The candlelight danced across the surfaces, revealing textures that were impossibly detailed, wrinkles that deepened when he looked directly at them, eyes that glistened with unspoken tears. The house seemed to feed on his attention, twisting reality to hold him captive within the rooms that were already a gallery of souls. He explored further, driven by a mix of curiosity and a growing, gnawing fear that to stop moving would be to surrender entirely. Doors opened into rooms filled with objects that should have belonged to other centuries. A cradle untouched, a piano with keys yellowed and cracked, a set of chess pieces mid-game, frozen in an eternal contest. He understood, without fully comprehending how, that the manor preserved fragments of time, memories, and lives, and that those who lingered risked becoming part of its permanent collection. As night deepened, the whispers grew louder, more coherent, and no longer confined to mere echoes. They formed sentences, pleading, warning, and accusing in turn. Do not linger. Stay. Watch. Sometimes the words overlapped, creating a cacophony that pressed against his skull. Other times, they were intimate, a single voice whispering his name as if it had known him all his life. Sleep was impossible. The walls themselves seemed to lean inward, eager to speak secrets he was both desperate and terrified to hear. Elias wandered into a chamber where the air was colder, unnaturally so. Frost glittered along the edges of the windows, and the floorboards shivered beneath his weight. He found a series of journals scattered across a table, each older than the last. He flipped through them feverishly, reading of the house's previous inhabitants, men and women who had disappeared without trace, leaving only cryptic writings about corridors that moved, shadows that whispered, and mirrors that reflected not truth but desire and fear. One passage made his blood run cold. The house remembers. It records each thought, each fear, each longing. It waits patiently, and when it chooses, it consumes. We are nothing more than echoes, and yet it hungers for more. A sudden noise made him start. The door to the chamber creaked closed behind him. He spun, candle in hand, and found the hallway beyond empty. Yet he was certain something had moved. A shadow stretched unnaturally, detaching itself from the corner of the room and sliding along the walls, maintaining a consistent, deliberate pace that matched his own steps. Panic surged, but he felt drawn, as if by gravity, toward the corridor's end. In his frantic wandering, he discovered a spiral staircase leading downward. The air grew heavy, damp, and filled with the unmistakable scent of decay. Old earth, rot, and something else. Something almost metallic. The staircase wound endlessly, yet also seemed to descend vertically, more than the building's structure allowed. He reached a landing where a single broken mirror reflected not only himself, but the hallway behind him. A hallway he had not seen before. Within the reflection, shadowy figures moved independently of reality, shifting, gesturing, and occasionally raising a hand toward him. When he looked away, the hall was empty. The figures vanished, but their eyes lingered in his mind. Sleep overtook him in short, fevered bursts, bringing dreams that were more waking visions than rest. He found himself wandering through corridors filled with doors, each opening onto scenes from the house's past. A child tumbling down a staircase, a servant locked in a chamber, a fire consuming the east wing, figures screaming silently, their mouths moving, yet no sound escaping. He tried to look away, but the house compelled him to witness each tragedy, imprinting their sorrow upon his mind as if he were both observer and participant. He awoke each time with the dawn thick upon the windows, drenched in sweat, hands trembling, and yet compelled to continue exploring. The house seemed to feed upon his fear, his fascination, and his obsession. Each corridor, each door, each whisper drove him further into a labyrinthine mindscape, where reality was fluid and terror was tangible. By the fourth night, Elias felt his sense of self beginning to fray. His reflection in the tarnished mirrors no longer matched his movements perfectly. Slight delays, subtle distortions, made him doubt his own body. Shadows leaned closer, brushing his arms, whispering secrets too fleeting to catch. The house was no longer merely a structure. It was a living presence, attentive, patient, and infinitely knowing. Yet, amidst the fear, a strange thrill persisted. He sensed that beyond the whispers, beyond the shifting corridors and spectral reflections, lay the heart of the house, a secret chamber, a truth that had remained hidden from all who had come before. The manor seemed to promise knowledge, revelation, and perhaps power, though at a price he dared not yet calculate. As he moved deeper into the twisting halls, Elias understood with a dread certainty. Pinewood Manor would not merely observe him. It would ensnare him, fold him into its memory, make him both witness and prisoner. And he, caught between fear and irresistible curiosity, could not, would not turn away. The shadows whispered, the corridors twisted, and the house waited, patient, by eternal Elias, heart hammering, candles guttering, stepped forward into the darkness that had already claimed part of his soul. The manor had begun to claim him in full, and Elias felt it with every step. He wandered the twisting corridors, candlelight trembling upon walls that seemed to lean inward, their shadows stretching and pulsing as if breathing with light. The whispers were no longer mere echoes. They had become voices, layered and persistent, calling not only his name, but his fears, his doubts, even his desires. Stay. Look. Remember. They wound through his mind, entwined with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. And he realized, with a dread that tightened his chest, that he was being measured, catalogued, observed in a way that transcended the natural. Driven by a mix of terror and fascination, he followed a corridor he had not known existed the night before. The walls here were narrower, the air heavier, and the floorboards groaned beneath his weight as though in protest. Every door along the hall was closed, yet he sensed movement behind them. A shadow curling just beyond the frame, a soft sigh, a shifting of dust, as if something or someone was pacing inside. The candlelight danced upon the surfaces, and Elias's reflection in the gilded frames along the wall seemed to ripple, a distorted echo of himself that moved independently of his own gestures. At the corridor's end, he discovered a staircase spiraling downward, hidden behind a false panel that swung open at his touch. The air that rose from below was thick with cold, carrying a scent that was at once earthy, metallic, and faintly sweet, a perfume of decay and history. He descended carefully, the staircase narrowing as it curved, until the candlelight revealed a heavy door, carved with grotesque motifs of twisted faces and intertwined limbs, faces that seemed to wriggle and shift as his gaze lingered. The key he had brought with him felt warm in his hand, almost alive. As he inserted it into the lock, the whispers surged, rising into a chorus of pleading, warning, and accusation. The voices overlapped, creating a dreadful harmony that pressed against his skull. He hesitated, heart hammering, but the pull of curiosity and dread was irresistible. The key turned with a low, resonant click, and the door creaked open. Beyond lay a chamber that seemed to exist outside of time. It was circular, its walls lined with mirrors that reached from floor to domed ceiling. The reflections multiplied infinitely, so that Elias saw himself in countless iterations, each subtly different, pale, gaunt, eyes hollowed, eyes wild and desperate, eyes calm and observing. Among the reflections were others, figures draped in shadow, their faces blurred, but their eyes burning with recognition. These were the former inhabitants, he realized with horror, trapped within the mirror's infinite surfaces, their gazes following him relentlessly. At the center of the chamber stood an altar-like pedestal, upon which lay a single, unassuming object, a journal bound in cracked leather. Elias approached, and the air seemed to pulse around him, vibrating with an almost palpable awareness. He opened the journal and began to read. The entries were penned by one Elias Vane, his late uncle, the same who had sent him the summons. "I have found it," one passage read, "the heart of the house. It is alive, aware, patient. Every corridor, every shadow, every whisper is part of it. A memory, a trap, a lure. It watches us, waits for us, feeds upon our fascination, our fear, our desires. To know its heart is to invite it to know you. And once known," Elias shivered, the candlelight flickering as if the house itself had drawn breath in response to his reading. Another passage chilled him further. "I have tried to resist. I have fled, only to find the corridors rearranged, the mirrors reflecting not what is, but what I fear, what I wish, what I cannot escape."
The whisper fades, yet the manor still watches. Its doors remain open, its shadows restless. Somewhere in the dark, Elias takes another step, and the house takes one closer in return. But the story is not over. The echoes grow stronger, the truth nearer. Stay with us. When the next chapter begins, the manor will whisper again.